Well, hello everyone on this sunny Vancouver day. I am wanting, as usual, to open the day before introducing Professor Zavaleta by acknowledging the lands on which we're standing, perhaps all the more so because we're so rooted in place lately, and so good time to reflect on this. But in particular, I'd like to acknowledge that UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation. And I'd also like to acknowledge that you're joining us today from many places near and far. And so to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands as well. I can't stress enough that I'm just incredibly pleased to introduce Erika Zavaleta today. She is the Howard Hughes Medical Institute Professor in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And I want to encourage you to have a look at her lab website, not only because it begins with a really great collective statement on Black Lives Matter, but also because it expresses so well their collective efforts to look very closely at the links between biodiversity and human well-being, something close to most of our hearts, and in general, and in reference to their stewarding and restoring of wild ecosystems. And I also want to bring to attention Professor Zavaleta's huge contributions to pedagogy. She's just an unparalleled mentor and teacher, be that in reference to her work with the Camino group. I'll leave that as a teaser. It's an inquiry-based training, a great model, and also focuses on making conservation science practical and on mentoring underrepresented communities. And of course, her work with UC Santa Cruz's Doris Duke Center for Conservation, the Conservation Scholars Program there is quite renowned, and she, as I understand it, runs that center. And I came to know of her work on biodiversity management given climate change maybe in the kind of late 2000s, not directly my field, but her reach is really inspiring. And somewhere in there, she also manages to publish accessible work like her award-winning book on California ecosystems with Harold Mooney, and also more personal and natural histories as they influence our understanding of ecology. So we're very lucky to have her today. So please join me in a warm welcome to Professor Zavaleta and her talk today on climate disruption, animal migrations, and equity in conservation science.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Terry. And I'm really excited to be with you all today. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. And I know that we have quite a bit of time for discussion, so I'm going to try to be very disciplined about not using too much time to tell you about my work. I'm in Santa Cruz in the unceded territory of the Awaswa-speaking Wipi tribe, whose descendants, the Amamutsun tribal band, work to restore traditional stewardship on their lands, including our campus. And as a researcher, what I and my lab work on are two patterns that many millions of years from now, someone will still be able to see the signs of: the sudden massive losses of much of the world's biodiversity and the radical changes to the Earth's climate and biogeochemical cycles that we're bringing about. So our research addresses the drivers and impacts of biodiversity loss and of climate and atmospheric changes, and also effective responses to those changes. That's a thread that I want to carry through what I'm going to talk about today. And there are a lot of things I could talk about because I have a wonderful lab group, and I want to say at the outset that a lot of this work is very collaborative. But what I'm going to focus on today are these two questions: how climate disruption is affecting animal migration, which is kind of a new direction for me, something I got curious about because I worked for quite a long time at the ecosystem scale and with a focus on plant communities. And then this other piece, given these challenges we're facing, how do we prepare future leadership that reflects all of society? I'm going to put up here just very briefly sort of a list of some of the other active projects in my lab group, because they range pretty broadly. And I'm excited to talk about these and other things with you all during the discussion session if you're interested. So I like to apply thinking across domains and to learn about new systems. And I got interested in animal migrations as a graduate student. My first paper in the mid-90s was actually about migratory waterfowl and the people who hunt them in Alaska. But my attention shifted to work on climate disruption, and I wanted to reconnect those pieces. So I began a project about 2 years ago to look at changes in global animal migrations that could be related to climate disruptions. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about that in the time we have. Now, every year, billions of animals undertake seasonal migrations, at scales ranging from kilometers to the globe. And these are some of the most ubiquitous and cherished wildlife spectacles on Earth. They move not only individual animals, but also biomass, nutrients, and their roles as prey, predators, competitors, and disease vectors, and so on. Let's get through this slide. When animal migrations are threatened by a suite of stresses that range from land cover change and direct harvest to fences, like you can see in this picture, and movement barriers. And migrations are especially vulnerable because they're sensitive to losses in connectivity, and they're also exposed to threats across their migratory routes. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of accelerating change in climate that's most rapid at these high northern latitudes. So this map shows the departure in mean annual temperature for each pixel from a long-term baseline of values ending in 1980. And the degree of red indicates how much warmer locations have gotten since that baseline, which now ended 40 years ago. So essentially everywhere on land, Earth has warmed 1 degree to more than 4 degrees Celsius in the last half century. But up here, where a great many fully and partially migratory birds breed, these areas have warmed the fastest. And models projecting future warming show a strengthening of that pattern, so that by the late part of this century, Arctic and northern and boreal forest regions, as well as the Himalayas, are expected to warm as much as 10 degrees Celsius from this baseline. So others have documented a variety of impacts at global scales on animal ecology, evolution, and behavior. And some of these include the effects of hunting and harvest on a variety of traits, effects on behaviors like nocturnality. Declines in the abundances of migratory species, which have declined on average faster than other species across major taxonomic groups. And then changes in migration phenology. So the timing of migration has changed, the distances animals migrate have changed, and their wintering distributions in particular have shifted towards the poles. We know that migration can evolve rapidly and can respond to environmental changes on pretty quick timescales. So this introduced eastern US population of house finches is one of the best documented cases in nature of the rapid appearance and spread of long distance migration as a behavior. It can also disappear rapidly. With selection experiments involving this species, people have shown that a population could become completely migratory or almost not fully non-migratory in 3 to 6 generations. And then we know that many bird species are partial migrants, which means that, like this Eurasian blue tit, they are composed of some individuals who migrate and some who remain resident year-round in one location. So we can describe these partially migratory populations using this term migrating fraction. And when I use it, I'm just referring to the proportion of a population that migrates. So along the spectrum of 0% to 100%, partial migrants tend to fall somewhere in between. And most studies of partial migrants involve populations that have a shared breeding site and from which some individuals migrate elsewhere for the winter. So in that type of partially migratory population, increased survival of winter residents or lower survival of migrants are both expected to select against the migratory strategy, reducing this migrating fraction. Currently, we have milder winter climates and breeding sites. Those are expected to reduce climate-related winter mortality at those sites. And at the same time, migration hazards at lower latitudes are increasing, and those range from hunting to habitat degradation to climate-related factors like drought. And so for them, some species, those factors are reducing migration survival. So the hypothesis that I tested is that migration fractions will have declined in recent decades. Specifically, that there'll be these negative slopes if we look at trends in the relationship between migrating fractions of populations of animals and time. And so I used meta-analytic methods to test this hypothesis. And I basically gathered data from the published literature and from theses. This is an example of a search string that I used, searching the references and the subsequent citations of usable papers that I found through a series of, this is kind of a portion of a longer string that I used to find papers. And in all, I screened over 2,000 papers, was able to include 18 of them, which yielded 57 total cases, reporting trends from 7 to 62 years long in migrating fraction in animals. This is an example of the data that I was extracting from papers. So in this example, I'm looking at the Eurasian blackbird. The site is all of the Netherlands, and I used distribution maps from BirdLife International to make sure that study sites in each study included breeding areas, or what are historically recognized as breeding areas. And then I used WebPlot Digitizer to extract data from graphs like this, and then computed slopes and variances. I analyzed using the R package metaphor, including species as a random effect. And I also did some meta regression. So looking at how latitude, taxonomic order, and some other factors might explain variation in migrating fraction over time. Okay, so this plot shows the effect size and 95% confidence intervals of each case in the study. And the mean across all studies is at the bottom. And the first thing I want you to notice is that almost all these studies are in birds. So I looked really hard beyond the avian literature, and in all was able to find 5 cases from mammals. I worked closely with a colleague who works with fishes. We could not find a single published case involving fishes, but we know that there are partial migrants across taxa and even including in invertebrates. So there's a real need to sort of expand this beyond the published literature, and that's the next step. So I'm going to include the mammals in here, but I want to talk about birds foremost, because that's really the group we can make any inferences about. As a group, just focusing on the birds. So what you can see down here, so the colored diamonds are the group means by taxonomic groups, so mammals and birds, and then the grand mean is here in gray. And among birds, so there's a decline that we can see over the last 40 years in partial migration. And the mean decline is about 6%, 0.6% per year. I'll just go back here so that I can show you that number. 0.6% per year does not sound like a lot, but over the last 40 years, that amounts to an overall decline of over 1/3 of the migrating subpopulation of all species studied. And that's occurred since about 1980. So I don't have time to tell you a lot more about what kinds of patterns are going on within those data, but I want to stress that, you know, if these trends continue at this time scale, we're looking at a very significant loss of migration over the next few decades. Okay, I also read each case for the author's explanation of the observed trend. So attribution ranged from speculation in some cases to, you know, modeling and statistical testing in others. But I could find 217 reasons given across these cases for the observed patterns in migrating fraction, or in another response variable that I didn't have time to tell you about, in the sizes of winter resident populations of these partially migratory species. So I classified each attribution into one of these categories. And you can see that 140 of the attributions, or 65% of all of them, were to climate change. And milder winters and warmer winter temperatures were the most common causes identified in this literature. There were another 41 attributions in areas where at least some of the response could have to do to climate change. And these are things like changes in the availability of wild foods in the winter, forest cover increases, so habitat change at high northern latitudes, and so on. I should also mention that there's some variation by taxonomic group in the important drivers. And so for water birds, a reduction in ice cover on bodies of water at high latitudes is also coming up more and more frequently as a reason for birds staying the entire winter rather than migrating south. So really briefly, one thing I didn't mention is that almost all of these cases are from Europe. There are a few cases, there are literally 3 or 4 in North America. There are none in the tropics in the published literature. So there's some big geographic holes that need to be filled. There are some key implications already though. So the first is that there are a variety of reasons migration in animals is declining around the world. One of the things that this makes clear is that this isn't just shrinking populations that is leading to declines in migration, but also outright loss of migratory behavior. That's interesting, and partly because, you know, some migratory species are responding rapidly to climate change in adaptive ways that could buffer its effects on their persistence. However, declines in migratory birds could also affect species interactions in the former migratory wintering areas from which these species are becoming more absent, increases in resident populations could also affect species interactions in the breeding distribution. And then there are these important bottlenecks that happen when species filter or funnel through stopover sites, places like the Chesapeake Bay on the East Coast, that do things like transmit disease among very dispersed breeding populations and control prey populations, like the populations of horseshoe crabs in the Chesapeake Bay, for instance, that we're losing potentially as these migrations decline. So those are of concern. And then an additional concern is that, you know, there's going to be a nonlinear response to continued change that shifts this from a resident strategy being the favored one to there being new dangers to resident populations at high latitudes that they will only encounter as they get warmer. So I'm just glancing at my time here. I want to come back here to just close this part of my talk by saying that there's a lot more work to be done at this meta-analytic scale, and I'm pretty interested in that. But we're also digging into this using rosy finches as a model system for variation and change in migratory behavior in the field. And so I'm happy to tell you more about that, but we're looking at rapid changes in movement in a species that we think is pretty responsive and pretty vulnerable to climate change. And that's helping us get a better understanding of how these processes might be unfolding on the ground. So I want to turn to this second major question that I put out when I began my talk. So the need for rapid advances, excuse me, let me go back here. We need to make more rapid advances in understanding and applying the understanding we gain to conservation and stewardship. We know that that's enormous in this era. And those needs are increasingly interdisciplinary, quantitative, cross-scale, and cross-cultural in nature. So as a STEM professor in higher education, I've gotten interested in applying scientific methods to improving how we train and prepare leaders in our field who can bring wider perspectives to bear on the kinds of challenges that I just talked about. And the fields of ecology and conservation science can help us best with solving climate and biodiversity and other crises, but to do that, they have to reach their potential as effective vehicles for science-based solutions. So ecology and biology majors around the country, and I recognize that you are part of an interdisciplinary group, many of you in the audience, so some of these issues don't necessarily apply in the same way, but I think on the STEM side of things, it's quite widespread and quite the case that we face these three critical shortfalls. The first shortfall is in preparing our undergraduate students for research careers, and frankly, in inspiring them for those careers. In the US, many graduating biology majors every year and STEM majors have never had an opportunity to be involved in research, a real opportunity, one with colleagues that goes from generating questions through the whole research process to being able to communicate findings. And then we have issues of retention. And I'll say more about that in a moment. And these are related to how we teach biology. And we have issues of diversity, which suffers in our field for a lot of reasons, but in part because retention is not the same across all student groups. And I'll show you a bit more about that. So we have this issue, and this is in the US, that a lot of people come into college, 1 in 8 entering US freshmen intending to major in biology, but then we lose half of them by the time they graduate. So the net movement among majors is very strongly away from biology, and this includes ecology. And retention is really, really different for students from different groups. It's much lower for African American, Latino, and Native American students, with the effect that by graduation, ERM students who are in the US, well under a quarter, sorry, nearly 40% of the population are well under a quarter of the biology majors that we graduate at a national level. So diversity is another break on our field's effectiveness. And I'm going to drill down and look at ecology for a moment. It's especially ecology that suffers from this. This is the percentage of biology PhD recipients from underrepresented backgrounds. And at 5% or so, ecology and evolutionary biology are way behind the diversity of other biology subfields, like the cellular and molecular fields. And we see this coming at the undergraduate stage even at a minority serving institution like my institution. So UC Santa Cruz is a Hispanic serving institution. It's recognized by the federal government for serving a large number of students from these marginalized backgrounds. And in our 2 biology majors, you can see that here's our student population as a whole, and the fraction of them who come from these marginalized racial groups. And this is the composition of the cellular, molecular, and developmental biology major. So they've kept up. And here's our ecology and evolutionary biology major. So we're behind. There are a lot of reasons for this. I'd love to talk about more in the Q&A. And then I wanted to zoom out to STEM-wide, because I think this is another important piece of the story. So this is, again, in the US, over time, the contributions of these underrepresented minority individuals to STEM faculty in red, postdocs, and PhD students across all STEM fields over the last 40 years. And you see something like this, and maybe you look at this and you say, it's growing too slowly, and you're right, but it does look like an increase. The trouble is you have to look at these in relation to how the demographics of the US as a whole have changed in that time. So if you look at that, US URM populations have climbed rapidly in the last 50 years. And so the distance between, in this case, I'm using the faculty line, between this line and the population as a whole has actually grown. I can plot that distance over time on its own pair of axes. And I'm going to plot it for members of these marginalized racial groups, but also for women, because I think there's an important lesson in this. So this is the gap, the absolute gap between the overall population of the US and STEM faculty members for women in blue and for members of these underrepresented minority groups in red. And you can see that if you look at the last decade, they're in a pretty similar place with regard to the gap between what we would expect to see and want to see and where we are. But the trajectories they've taken to get there are really different. So for women, it appears at this very pulled back level, like we are on the right track. We have figured out how to increase the representation and participation of women in STEM fields. And we have not done that for Latino, Black, Indigenous scientists. They continue to be underrepresented with a growing gap. So doing something about this is a matter of sustaining scientific growth. It's also a matter of justice. And it's happening because at every stage, from undergraduate to graduate to postdoc, something different is happening for scientists and would-be scientists from these groups that is causing them to leave, because they're there at the beginning. They start college wanting to pursue STEM and biology in proportion to their presence in our society. We have those data. We need from our academic seats to be able to remedy this. So I set some goals to work towards during the remainder of my career, and I'll just share them here. First, that students have a chance, if they want to do mentored, authentic research, meaning from start to finish, not just like weighing samples in my lab while they're undergraduates. Second, that we get rid of demographic disparities in retention, experience, and outcomes. And third, that leadership, so not just the workforce. I think there's a lot of talk about the workforce reflecting US demographics, but I would like to see leadership reflect our society, that leadership includes the best among all of us and the values and the knowledge and approaches that all of us have to contribute. So in 2017, we started Camino, the Center to Advance Mentored Inquiry-Based Opportunities at UC Santa Cruz, to grow field science and field research opportunities at our campus. And in 2015, I started the Doris Duke Conservation Scholars Program here at UCSC. And whereas Camino serves students who are at UCSC for their undergraduate years, the Doris Duke program is a national program. It draws freshmen and sophomores from throughout the US into a 2-summer leadership and research intensive. And I don't have time to talk much about the results of these 2 programs, but what I will say is that they are small number, high investment programs. These programs involve selecting on the order of 60 students a year and putting a lot of energy into helping them become leaders. And that's working, right? I mean, they're going to graduate school. They are getting really like exciting fellowships. We have Rhodes and Fulbright and Udall and Truman Scholars and so on. But there's a complement to this, which is to look at ways in a high numbers approach to address these issues. So I want to talk a little bit more about that and about curriculum. So research-based field courses are an important part of both of those programs and of achieving the goals I outlined. And that's because, we know these are important to many of us. Many of us chose our careers in one way or another because of a field experience early in our studies. They build scientific skills, they build confidence living and working in the field, and they build all these shared memories and communities. And those things sustain students throughout college and beyond. So if field courses can serve all students equitably, then they're an important vehicle for opportunity and for inclusion in our field. That if is critical because field courses can also obstruct inclusion without the intentional work to overcome barriers that affect students more from certain groups, from underrepresented groups. And there are all these barriers to taking field courses that we might not see if they don't apply to us. There are barriers having to do with financial means, with access to word of mouth and other information about the opportunities, with previous experience, with a sense of belonging and whether one belongs on a field team or in a field course, and then with constraints around commitments to family and community and work. So to do a field course in a way that makes it possible for students of all backgrounds to take it, in a way that reduces instead of magnifying disparities, means removing at every step of the process these barriers. And I don't have time again to walk through this in detail, but I'll refer you to this reference where there's sort of more than this packed in here to walk through the process of how to plan and implement and then continually refine inclusive courses like this. So you have to design for inclusion. You have to include comprehensive funding. You have to select students not for past achievement, but for future potential and impact as well. You have to do strong prep for both the students and the mentors. And then we ask everyone, how can we do better for the next year? So in my last few minutes here, I just want to talk a little bit about looking at curricular reform. And a specific piece of this that we're interested in is whether an early, fairly light field science experience, so a small course, a 2-unit course that's like a lab that you can tack onto a normal course load early in your academic career, can affect student outcomes and can help us build diversity and retention in our field. So Introduction to Field Research is a pre-majors class for freshmen and transfers that we first offered in 2016 at our campus. And we compared it to our large core lecture class that we currently require in ecology and evolution. It is a class, the lecture class, that disproportionately removes students of color from our major. And we know that from looking at statistics. So we implemented the class in 2016. We scaled it up to more offerings in 2017. And one of the effects of that, I just want to show briefly, is that it closed these demographic gaps just in who participated in field courses in our major. So we have about 300 ecology and evolutionary biology majors each year. And the black line here over time shows you the proportion of students from these underrepresented racial groups who take the Gateway lecture course. So that's a good index of who's in the major. And the blue shows what proportion of those students are participating in field courses. And you can see that, for years, there's a little exception here, field course participation really lagged the demographics of the major. And then in 2017, it shifted. And I wish I had the data here for subsequent years, but it has stayed sort of shifted in this direction. So we used mixed methods, surveys like this, and also some qualitative methods that I don't have time to talk about right now, to compare student responses to the required lecture and the 2-unit field intro. And we were interested in how they shape core science competencies, connection to STEM, sentiments associated with persistence in the sciences, so using validated survey instruments that measure those sentiments. And this scale, just in general, this sort of five level Likert scale, gives us the ability to compute mean scores, to look at changes in scores for each question if we ask it at the beginning and the end of the course. And so I'm going to just show you findings based on this kind of survey instrument today.
Erika, you have 5 minutes remaining.
Thanks. Okay. So this shows you change from the start to the end of each course in students' self-reported skills and connection, with the effect of the lecture core class in black and of the intro field course in blue. And so these are deltas, right? Not absolute scores on that 1 to 5 self-efficacy kind of scale. You can see that the 2-unit field course strongly outperformed our required lecture class. And in some of the areas, it's not too surprising. A field research course boosts students' confidence in their field research skills more than a lecture class. But other areas, I was surprised to see this big a difference, much more of a sense of being welcomed into STEM, more interest in graduate school, or more of an increase in an interest in graduate school. Using the PITS survey, the Persistence in the Sciences survey, we found that the field course also generated stronger science identity and belonging than the course that we currently require all our majors to take. So this shows you, for the 5 science identity items on the PITS survey, how students responded at the end of the lecture class and of the field class, right? The lecture on the top, the field second on each. These are statements that students can rate their agreement with, like, I have come to think of myself as a scientist, and I feel like I belong in the field of science. And on all these items, the field course students scored significantly higher than the lecture students. So the field class is boosting students' sense of belonging in science more, which is linked to greater science persistence. And so this figure shows you what happened for students from those marginalized demographic groups. So this one is just looking at, for the skills, how from the beginning of the course at the circles to the end of the course in the squares, students ranked their abilities in each of these areas. And then the underrepresented minority students are in green and their well-represented peers are in gray. So this line is changed over the course of taking this class. And for some of these items, it's really clear. So there's a significant difference in the amount of gain that happened. And the reason for that is that students from these marginalized groups started with lower self-confidence about their abilities in some of these areas, but they caught up by the end of the class. So they're now able to embark on the rest of their STEM pursuits together in terms of confidence and experience, and in this community of peers that formed over time together in the field. So what did we learn? First of all, we need this class or something like it for all of our majors, especially at a campus like ours, but regardless of that, because all students experienced important gains. We're writing grants to try to scale it up to more majors. We're hoping to make it a required piece of our curriculum. And it's sort of the first step of broader curriculum reforms that I think are not only going to make our field more relevant to solving these problems, but more inclusive and equitable. And then, finally, there's this idea in STEM, especially, that students have to master a lot of content first, and only after that can participate in real research. But we found that students just arriving at college and from a lot of different majors were able to co-create research and to become scientists in the process without a lot of content mastery. And that insight makes clear to us that a flipped curriculum in biology that puts research at the front of the major experience to motivate and give meaning to all that subsequent content learning could be a powerful tool to improve retention and diversity in our field. And I hope that the upheaval we're all experiencing because of COVID helps us reflect on what really matters in preparing future scientists and leaders in our fields. So to come back to the questions I touched on today, we have the opportunity to build understanding of how the world is changing and what we need to do to address it effectively. And we also have the opportunity to contribute something we know is important for tackling both ecological and justice challenges. They're both enormous obstacles to both the good life and to each other. So I just want to encourage everyone to think of your potential in science as educators and mentors and advocates, as well as in terms of research contributions. Because if we're in this to build a better world, which is certainly why I came to this field, we have a lot of ways to leverage our positions and our expertise to move in that direction, and we should use all of them. Thank you, and thanks to a lot of people who contributed to this work.
Wow. First of all, thank you, Erika. That was just exactly the right talk at exactly the right time for us. These are such active conversations here, and the evidence on the field course, the early introduction of field course, that's just stunning, among other parts of it. So thank you very much. As I mentioned before, we have this sort of combination of students going first, questioning, and then we move over to the whole group, which is faculty and others. So I see a hand up, but I'll wait for a student hand first if there is one there. And if not, we'll move on. Questions, folks? Please use the raise hand function or chat. Claire Ewing, that is.
Hi, thank you so much for a great talk. I was wondering how much collaboration or interest you've had from other departments, especially in STEM, about your findings. And, like, is anyone else interested in creating their own similar course?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. That's a great question. I think, I didn't really talk about our model for scaling. A lot of our model for scaling is for other people to decide this is a good idea and to do it themselves. So, so I'm all for that. And I think, I think the short answer is yes. And just some quick examples of that. I've spoken with faculty who are starting programs with more of an internship component that is like what we do in Camino and Doris Duke. So the Fuerte program at UC Santa Barbara, for instance, just started this year, following that model. And then at UCSC, that other biology department, MCD biology, they sort of looked at what we were doing with actually a slightly different class and, decided that they wanted to see the outcomes from our evaluation of that class and to use that as a tool to convince their chair to implement a similar class. So, those are just a couple of examples, but I think the answer is yes. My tendency is to want to focus most on our fields because I'm most sort of passionate about biodiversity, climate, and justice intersections. And so I'd probably put less energy than I could into, for instance, like getting our chemistry department to adopt this than I have into other programs like ours doing that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I can imagine picking some programs over other for that priority. And I don't see any other student hands. Am I missing any? Not that I see here. So if we don't see any, Gayleen, why don't you go ahead and then I'll move on to Kai's question.
Yes, sorry, Kai, to jump in on you there at the last second. Thanks so much for your talk, Erika. I found it really, really fascinating. It's a little bit of a sort of sequel to Claire's question there, but I just wonder how you get the university, the institution, to invest in these small number, high investment educational courses and programs, given that the university is so often interested in reaching as many students as possible and perhaps what might be considered more surface level experiences. And I just wonder how, A, you think you can get them to invest in these smaller programs that are perhaps linked clearly through your work to equity, diversity, and inclusion goals as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in many ways, that's the question. And working at a public university in the US means that money's always short. And it's less expensive to have a 300-person lecture class than it is to have a 28-person field course. So, I mean, I think that the faculty have all come around to the idea that this is a really important thing to do. And I think what they're swayed by are the data. Which is, the data, and I would say, the piece I did not have time to talk about at all is the whole qualitative piece. I mean, the things that our students write about their experiences, about what it was like for them to realize that they actually love the process of science and are really excited to survive all those other courses to be able to keep doing it. Those are also really powerful. So I think that it's not the whole answer, but part of why I've taken this dive into studying the outcomes of these courses is that's the language of the people in our fields and our division is data. And it's another research question to sort of look at how much we can pare back the field-based, the intensive immersive parts of these classes and still get the outcomes. I think that's another piece of it. So to offer this class to 300 students a year, right now it's 2 weekend field trips and 4 afternoon field trips. I want to do the experiment. Like, what if we only have 1 weekend field trip? What if we have no weekend field trips and just substitute more afternoons? And that takes out the vans, the camping equipment, like there's a whole lot of cost reduction there. But do we still get the outcomes we want? And I think, to scale it, that's really what we want to know. Like, how can we make this not such a big difference from the lecture class, especially if the outcomes are so much better for the students. The other piece I'll just mention is that it really helps to be able to point to other programs in our field and say, look at this program over here, look at how much more hands-on course-based opportunity there is at these other institutions. So we've tried to collect examples of other public universities that are doing a better job giving their students lab and field-based experiences to be able to say, like, look, we have to fund this because this is the standard in our field. Like, this is the way we're supposed to be doing this. But it's hard work, and mostly we just raise a lot of grant money so far.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's hopeful still. Kai, go ahead, and then Nigel after Kai.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Erika. That was an amazing talk. It's really great to hear it. And I want to just offer a really brief comment on the second half, which I just can't resist because it was so compelling. But I also have a question on the first half. I think that field courses are also really interesting, you know, in particular the ones that involve going away. And I feel like from my experience, which has been mixed, very mixed in terms of good and bad, I actually nearly got turned off of ecology due to a field course. It wasn't due to race issues, although it's true that everyone else was white. But more the kind of inculcation that I felt in terms of a like 24/7 work schedule. And 25% of the class was on participation. And the fact that like in the morning, instead of going out for optional field trips, I was going for a run because I was training for triathlons was just like, and I scored terribly in terms of participation because I wasn't willing to give up all of my time on the field course. And so for me, I really felt like it was, you know, selecting for people who were willing to give their entire life to science. And although I loved science, that wasn't me. So I'm just gonna, that's my comment. I'm interested to hear your response on it, but my question actually goes to the climate and bird migration work. You noted how there was this massive number of attributions to climate change. And I wonder what you think of that. It strikes me that migration is a kind of triple jeopardy kind of problem, right? Where in order for the migratory fraction to do well in a population, they have to make it both, you know, all the way to the other grounds. And then the habitat has to be in a good, you know, habitat, and everything else that a bird needs to survive also has to be good in the other territory. And that in the context of this, you know, pervasive human degradation of habitat and all kinds of other impacts on birds along the way, that the triple jeopardy itself, separate from climate, would select against the migrating fraction, and that it might be a kind of climate bias in this attribution rather than thinking about those other factors. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on, like, what did you think of those attributions? How much evidence was there for that in relation to the other factors?
Yeah, thanks, Kai, and it's good to see you. Thanks for both of those, both the comment and the question. I think, so I'll address them in the order that you gave them. With respect to that sort of 24/7 aspect of immersive field courses, I think that's absolutely right. That you know, it's kind of one of the things on that list of core potential barriers is that, you know, you have a life, like you have, and you know, that can take a lot of forms. Often for our students, it takes the form specifically of a job. They have a job and they're not going to quit the job to take a class. So I mean, I think that on the other hand, we know how immersive field courses can be these big positive transformative experiences if they're done right. So to me, the answer is that we need a variety of there's not a one size fits all field course. And so I've really been delighted to see in our curriculum, you know, this sort of proliferation of field courses that are low intensity, that are not the, you know, 3 or 4 weeks of travel version, but are the ones that are, you know, afternoon labs or, you know, maybe a weekend or two and some local outings. It works particularly well where we are because the weather is good and we have a bunch of different kinds of ecosystems that you can literally walk to from our campus. But I mean, that's critical. And, you know, people have always underappreciated that, you know, there's ecology in cities too. So even if you are an urban campus, I've seen these wonderful photographs of people doing field courses, you know, in cities around telephone poles and, you know, the birds on wires and the diversity of plants and tree planters. And, you know, so this is not even parks, but sort of the urban environment itself. So, you know, this is a couple different ways to think more broadly about what it is to do a field course. And those low immersion opportunities can be really, really critical for getting more people able to participate. Yeah, I mean, I've been teaching online field courses for the last year, and they're great. Everyone just kind of does their homework in their backyard, or, you know, on the sidewalk, counting birds and pacing off, you know, distances and whatever else. So I appreciate that. And then on your question about the climate bias in the attribution data, is a super important question. One of the things that I wonder about is whether that's just sort of something that people have really especially wanted to publish on. I think one of, so a couple things sort of mitigate my concerns about that, but they don't make it go away. One of the things that mitigates my concern about that is the amount of the literature that deals with this that is, you know, really completely obscure. So these are not papers in high impact journals, and some of them are like, you know, in Czech or Russian or Polish in a very, very obscure sort of natural history journal. And I think, you know, what it means is that a lot of this is really more natural history based sort of observation than it is trendy ecology. So that kind of, you know, makes me feel like a little bit better about when there is discussion about the potential drivers. It's pretty meaningful. I would also say that in a majority of the papers, there's some quantitative look at more than one potential driver. So in some of the papers, the only thing they look at is climate. That is clearly a problem. That's what they're looking for. So they're going to find it even if the proximate reasons are different. But in most of the papers, there's, you know, there's explicit consideration of other factors too. I think a step that I need to take here, two things. One is to go back through and do a more quantitative look at attribution. So people have suggested that I weight the attributions by how quantitative they are and how rigorously they're arrived at. That's a little challenging because my weighting scheme would be completely arbitrary no matter what I did. So I haven't done that. But I think the other piece is to go and work with primary data. So there, we have good data from breeding bird surveys, for instance, and Christmas bird counts that we could apply to at scale, you know, doing this from scratch and doing it without that bias. But we're not there yet. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Erika. That was terrific extra detail, and thanks, Kai. Nigel.
Hey there. Thanks for that amazing talk. It's been one of my favorites so far. So I wanted to ask a question. My middle-aged white dad sent me a news article a couple of weeks ago about a recent professional development seminar for teachers in Oregon or Washington on eliminating systemic racism in math education. And apparently the availability of that seminar was causing some uproar, and that uproar eventually got the seminar canceled. And as far as I can tell why, the main reason was that the organization that was hosting it had at some point said that having right answers in math might disadvantage racialized or otherwise marginalized youth. And it seems to be pretty much the whole thing that anyone took, the only thing that anyone took from the whole incident. So I thought it's probably worth talking about. And I guess I'm wondering, is there something about STEM or empiricism or even Western epistemology or ontology that inherently disadvantages these youth? And can whatever that is be exercised from those fields without losing their essence?
Oof, wow, Nigel, thanks for your kind words, and thanks for that really, really difficult but critical question. Okay, I think the way that I can take a stab at that is a little bit indirect. I mean, you know, there's a lot to chew on there, especially with respect to math in particular. I love math, but it's definitely not like my worldview. Those are two different things, and so I could say more about that. I think that I was a social sciences student as an undergraduate. I was actually initially a biology major and left and majored in cultural anthropology. So I am firsthand one of those data points who ditched biology during my first year. And I did my master's.
Me too, for the record.
What's that?
Sorry, me too, for the record. Biochem to psychology.
But I guess I raised that because if I really reflect on why I made that switch, I would say that the emphasis in STEM on content was very different from the emphasis in the social sciences and humanities on process. How do you learn? How do you make inferences? how do you know like how good your inference is? How does it depend on who you are? That is like most of the conversation in the field that I ultimately did my undergraduate and master's degrees in. And it's like none of the conversation in STEM. And I think that big gap in putting into context the knowledge that we sort of mostly feed to students as information is really problematic. So, you know, are there right answers in math? Yeah, within the particular frame of math, but what is that frame and what is it not? Like, I think that if we teach science a little bit more like we teach anthropology, we would pay more attention to epistemologies of knowledge and what this particular one is. What is this scientific approach? And what are its strengths? And what do we set aside by focusing on this particular approach? And then, you know, these things we've set aside, how do we bring them back in? So I guess it's not a very well-formed answer because I think the questions you're asking are really hard, but I see real potential, you know, not in sort of flipping science on its head, but in placing it to context and teaching more with an eye to what the process is and how that process sits alongside other processes of generating knowledge towards solving problems.
That's a great answer. I had my hand up, so I'm just going to add to that because it fits in there, and then Ben will go next. So on that note, I mean, that does suggest, or I was wondering whether in the field courses, what was happening that was really increasing answers to those questions like identity as a scientist, which were just great questions, really nice and clean and really captured that. Is that, so is that your, would you answer it in the same way that the success of those courses was a function of their in context learning and their focus on processes and so on?
I think that's part of it. I mean, I like to talk about two ways that those courses work. And one is focusing on the process of science and not the content. And, you know, by doing this with non-science majors in their freshman or transfer year, like really, there's no content. It's all this curiosity about what you see in the world. And the content then becomes like, well, how do you formulate a question? How do you design a feasible little study to tackle that question? How do you sample? How do you do that without bias? How do you replicate? How do you analyze those data? How do you convey visually what your findings were? And how do you talk about them? And how do you interpret them in light of other people's? Like all of that is like how to do science. It's like nothing about, you know, existing theory or anything like that. And I think what that does is it gives students the opportunity to just be scientists, right? Not to learn about science or learn about how other people do science, but to experience the process themselves. And by having more than one project, so by having this iterative structure, we do a project and the first one's always kind of a disaster and the students are like, what? You know, and then they get to try it again and then try it again. And they see themselves, the gains that they're making with each iteration. And they can reflect on that and wow, I got better at this. Like this time,
Nice.
we were coordinated. This time, I knew how to graph these data and what they meant and, you know, what was a good sampling design. And so I think that piece is really important. The other piece that I don't feel like we talk about enough is that, you know, to belong in science, there are a couple components of that, but a really big obvious one is just like to belong in a series, you know, in a community, like to have relationships. And when you spend time in the field, and it doesn't even have to be overnight, it has to be long enough to have to go pee and to have to eat a meal and to have to like sit down and take a rest. I would say roughly.
Great criteria. Yeah.
You know, then you start to kind of relate to the other people over there, including your instructors, as people, right? Not as like competitors, not as people who are trying to pour knowledge down your throat or who are scary, but who actually also have to pee and eat a sandwich and sit down for a while, and take off layers. That is really profound. I know that seems, I mean, and I feel like everybody kind of knows that intuitively, but we don't teach like that in right? We don't teach as people and about and kind of in the context of relationship. And that's what, you know, that's what people define themselves by. We know this better in this past year than ever. You know, it's by relationship and by kind of connection and a sense of who you are in relation to the other people around you. And I think that part of field courses and really any courses, if you structure them more that way, is super important to people feeling a sense of belonging in a community that is science or that's environmental conservation or climate justice or whatever it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And that rings entirely true. I think we have Ben, please go ahead. And I'm not sure we have time for any more questions beyond that, but floor to you, Ben.
Hi, Ben.
Hey, well, I love the idea of putting like research first and content second, and having these authentic research experiences be something that is available to all from the get-go. And I mean, I think this is an idea that, you know, a lot of people are thinking about and maybe want to move that direction. And it's something that you have actually been doing and moved that direction, and are like not just a goal for the future. And so, I mean, I'm curious about a lot of things, but one thing I'm particularly curious about is what have you learned as the, you know, the instructor in setting things up in the course of doing this for many years, that you know now that you didn't at the start, and so those of us who will start these sort of things maybe don't have to repeat your exact trajectory.
That's awesome. Yeah, thanks for that question, Ben, and good to see you. I think if I think back to when I first taught like this, so in an inquiry-based research mode, as opposed to like a sort of let's learn natural history, let's collect data the way I've already decided that you're going to, the skill to develop is a bunch of logistical things, right? I'll say something about that in a second, but the skill to develop is how to facilitate the science process for the students without guiding. Like, you don't want to guide it too little, because then it just completely crashes and burns sometimes. You know, I want to study mountain lions in the next 3 hours. Like, that's not going to happen. Probably. You know, but not to facilitate too much either. Like, there's this magic that happens when it's actually theirs and you didn't totally feed it to them. And so I feel like that's the thing that over time takes some skill to develop. And what I would say from a practical perspective is that it actually means having sort of a catalog of ideas in your head about what they might do, and just like being open then to whatever their ideas are, to sort of taking that catalog and modifying the things in it, and sort of, you know, using it to sort of fuel facilitating where they're trying to go in a design process. It's pretty labor intensive. Like, to do this well, I feel like you kind of want like somebody on staff or a grad student or something like that for every 2 groups of students, like, which means for every 8 students. So, you know, I try to scoop up a lot of my grad students to come and spend a weekend in the field, like that kind of thing. Another way that this can get expensive, I do think that one of the things we've started to develop is having undergraduates who've taken a course come back as course assistants, and they can do it for credit rather than for money, right? Sometimes, I mean, but you know, if they're getting a bunch of credit towards their degree, learning how to teach field science, that's a really nice way to boost their self-confidence and their skills, and support the students who are coming through for the first time. Everybody wins, and it doesn't require 6 TAs for a 30-person class. On the logistics side, I think, you know, you have to resist the temptation to go really like high-tech science on everybody. Like, we keep playing with, should we use drones? Should we like just try all this fancy cutting edge stuff? And I think especially early on, like the most learning happens if you just kind of keep it simple. So we have this van that's like full of transect squares and tapes and quadrats and, I don't know, counters and canopy, like the metal densiometers and stuff like that. And it's easy to like want to do the stuff that's like what we all do, eye buttons and whatever else, but I think that that's not actually critical at the outset. It's more important to make it so that the tools aren't daunting. And we're trying to move our statistics out of JUMP to our studio, because I think that that serves the students better in the long run, but that's really hard because it is kind of daunting. So that's another kind of, you know, line to walk between giving them exposure to the stuff that's really most recently like come online to help us build new knowledge, and keeping it non-intimidating.
Thanks.
Yeah, really nice thing to remember and to close on as well. But Erika, I can't thank you enough. That was just fabulous, and really super important, I would say near explosive set of conversations that you've just initiated there, and things that we're thinking of en masse. And so, yeah, wonderful suggestions, both across the board. So I'm afraid we may be knocking on your door again a few more times. But
That would be
and
great.
when that paper is published too on the results of that, yeah, or any version of that you want to circulate, I'd be happy to pass that around.
Thank you.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
a number of the things I referred to are just on the cusp of being out, and
Mhm.
bother
Yeah.
me again for them, and I'd happily send you the in-press versions.
Okay, well, we'll be in touch, but again, yeah, huge thanks. That was
Thank you
just
so
exactly
much.
right.
This has been a huge pleasure. I love the format, and it's great to see some familiar faces too.
Yeah, that's great. And yes, have a wonderful rest of the day, and we'll be in touch. Thanks,
All right.
thanks so very much.
Bye-bye.